Ladies and gentlemen, buckle up, because the latest economic data is about as pleasant as finding a parking ticket on your brand new sedan. While some may attribute the January 0.5% plunge in inflation-adjusted consumer spending solely to record-breaking winter weather, seasoned observers know there's a bitter truth lurking beneath the snowfall, a long-standing cocktail of misguided policies, aggressive tariffs, and a chronic inability to address the fundamentals of a resilient economy. Let's not beat around the bush. The data is crystal clear. After a roaring holiday season, U.S. consumers have collectively slammed the brakes on spending, marking the largest monthly decline in nearly 4 years. At first glance, you might wonder if this is simply a post-holiday breather, as noted by EY's chief economist Gregory Dacko, but a closer look reveals a deeper malaise. When consumers shun big-ticket purchases like motor vehicles and cut back on recreational goods, it's not just a seasonal hiccup. It's a red flag waving in the wind, warning us that caution is now the new currency. Consider this: the decline is not an isolated demographic anomaly. Instead, it appears to signal the rise of a more cautious consumer entering 2025, one who's wary of spending in an economy seemingly held hostage by contradictory fiscal and monetary policies. After experiencing the revelry of the holiday season, consumers now face a harsh reality where everyday purchases are under siege from a multitude of external pressures. The Bureau of Economic Analysis, BEA, has unearthed mixed blessings in their latest report. Yes, on one hand, the Federal Reserve's favored measure of underlying inflation, the Core Personal Consumption Expenditures, PCE, price index, excluding food and energy, crept up only 0.3% from December. Over the span of the last year, however, it recorded a 2.6% increase, signaling that while inflation might be softening in technical measures, the persistent underlying pressures remain all too real. Now, let's spice things up by delving into one of the government's favorite pastimes, tariff imposition. In an almost theatrical twist of irony, while the administration continually touts the virtues of protecting domestic jobs and industries, its own policies have inadvertently fanned the flames of a burgeoning trade deficit. New tariffs on imported goods, rhetorically promised by none other than the Trump-era playbook, have coincided with an unexpected surge in imports. The result? A U.S. goods trade deficit that widened to record levels in January. One might ask, how does this affect the everyday consumer? The answer is painfully direct. With tariffs in place, imported goods become more expensive, pushing price pressures higher and effectively strangling the purchasing power of the average American. Add in the chilling effect of these policies on domestic producers, who are left scrambling to adjust or risk losing global competitiveness, and you have a perfect storm that endangers economic stability. Speaking of price pressures, let's not overlook the slow but relentless creep of inflation into every nook and cranny of the consumer basket. While the core PCE's year-on-year increase of 2.6% might seem like a victory when compared to more explosive past trends, it is anything but reassuring. Look at goods prices excluding food and energy, which surged by 0.4%, the highest monthly increase we've seen since early 2023. Meanwhile, core services prices edged up by 0.2%. These creeping cost increases indicate that while headline inflation numbers might be tamed by technical adjustments, the underlying costs of living continue to gnaw at households' disposable incomes. It doesn't stop there. An alternative measure of overall core inflation, which strips out those pesky imputed prices that sometimes try to mask the true cost burdens, still managed a 0.2% monthly uptick. In a world where every fraction of a percent matters, these persistent increases are like termites feasting on the foundation of our economy. Now, let's flip the coin to consumer income. Nominal incomes in January showcased a seemingly commendable 0.9% increase, a number buoyed by, you guessed it, a cost of living adjustment for Social Security beneficiaries. On paper, this boost appears promising. But when measured in inflation-adjusted terms, disposable personal income only grew by 0.6%. What does this tell you? The average American might be earning a bit more in nominal dollars, but the real kicker is that these gains are quickly devoured by soaring prices. In other words, a modest bump in income isn't enough to offset the rapidly rising costs of everyday necessities. Consequently, the nation's saving rate has climbed to its highest level since June. And while saving might sound virtuous, in this context it's a forced, defensive maneuver, a collective signal that consumers are bracing for tougher economic times ahead, hoarding every last dollar in anticipation of even higher prices or deeper economic downturns. Enter the Federal Reserve, our ever-watchful guardian of monetary stability. Fed officials have repeatedly signaled that their next course of action is contingent upon a meaningful easing in inflation. But here's the kicker: the current data, despite offering a glimmer of hope on core inflation numbers, simultaneously reveals a stubborn price pressure in several categories. With nominal incomes only modestly rising and core inflation showing teeth, the Fed is caught in a veritable catch-22. Interest rates have remained high for a reason: they're meant to temper the economy when inflation risks spiral out of control. However, by keeping rates elevated in this climate of uncertain consumer confidence, the Fed inadvertently dampens the very spending that drives growth. This misalignment of policy objectives leaves US asking, when will the authorities heed the gentle, or not so gentle, warnings from the data? The unfortunate answer is that political agendas and bureaucratic inertia continue to dictate policy long after sensible economic measures would have been implemented. The impact of these intertwined issues has been clearly reflected in the markets. The S&P 500 opened lower, and Treasury yields took a hit in the wake of the latest BEA data release, clear signs that investors are jittery about the economy's prospects. Meanwhile, despite the slight moderation in headline inflation numbers, the dollar has maintained its strength, a token reminder that in times of economic uncertainty, investors flock to what they perceive as safe havens. But make no mistake, the markets are not celebrating any kind of economic revival here. Instead, they're bracing for a future where consumer spending continues to sag, service sector growth remains tepid, and the cumulative effects of years of inconsistent policies begin to sting more acutely. The persistent rise in long-term inflation expectations, now at the highest level in almost 30 years, according to University of Michigan data, further underlines the deep-seated anxieties that have gripped both consumers and investors alike. Now, let's address the elephant in the room, government management. It has become painfully apparent that the labyrinthine maze of policy decisions, the imposition of tariffs, the hesitancy to reform outdated practices, and a seemingly endless round of blame shifting between administrations, has done little to bolster economic resilience. Instead, these maneuvers have only deepened existing vulnerabilities. Take, for instance, the much-touted tariffs that were supposed to protect American industry. In reality, while these measures may have been conceived as a bold economic strategy, they've instead contributed to pushing the goods trade deficit to unfathomable heights. A policy instrument meant to shield domestic markets is now undercutting its very foundation by spurring imported goods prices, thereby increasing the cost of living for millions. Adding insult to injury, legislative debates in Washington often devolve into a theatrical display of partisanship, where policy decisions are guided more by political expediency than by sound economic principles. Recent surveys among Fortune 500 CFOs reveal that over 70% see policy uncertainty as the greatest risk to their operations. This is not the mark of a stable, forward-thinking government, it's a recipe for stagnation and slow-motion recession. So, what does the future hold if these trends persist? If consumers continue to rein in their spending, if the high tariffs and protectionist impulses remain unchecked, and if the Fed continues its cautious dance around inflation, then brace yourself for a collision course with recession. The current indicators aren't just statistical anomalies, they're symptomatic of deeper, structural issues that have been festering for years. Consider this: when consumer spending, the engine of our economy, starts sputtering, the effects are akin to pulling the emergency brake in the midst of a high-speed chase. The drastic drop in motor vehicle purchases isn't merely about fewer shiny new cars on the lot, it's a foreboding sign that buyers are losing confidence in an economy preoccupied with internal squabbles rather than forward progress. The same goes for recreational goods, items that once symbolized discretionary spending and the vibrancy of a healthy consumer sector are now witness to an erosion of consumer optimism. It's time for policymakers to stop patting themselves on the back for marginal improvements in abstract inflation metrics and face the inconvenient truth: the American economy is at a crossroads. The current trajectory, marked by defensive savings, cautious spending, and a trade imbalance ballooning out of proportion, is unsustainable. The bureaucratic inertia and political grandstanding that have defined recent policy decisions are not just out of touch, they're actively undermining the stability of our economic future. So here's the bitter pill to swallow: the economic slowdown we're witnessing is not a random misfortune, nor is it solely the result of Mother Nature's icy grip this January. It is a clarion call, a wake-up call, that the policies dictating America's economic path are in desperate need of a serious overhaul. The Fed's reluctance to reverse course on high interest rates, the government's misguided tariff strategies, and the pervasive uncertainty in policymaking are all converging into a perfect storm that threatens to drag the U.S. economy into a prolonged state of mediocrity, if not outright recession. For ordinary Americans and finance professionals alike, the current state of affairs is a jarring reminder that when economic policy is hijacked by political theater rather than grounded in empirical reality, the consequences are not mere numbers on a spreadsheet. They manifest in dwindling consumer confidence, stubbornly high price pressures, and a future where the promise of economic prosperity is continually deferred. Until policymakers learn to balance short-term political gains with long-term economic sustainability, until they learn that consumer confidence is the lifeblood of a thriving economy, the American people will continue paying the price. And in the grand finale of this economic farce, it will be the common citizen who ends up holding the bill for decades of misdirected government spending and bungled policy decisions. In summary, the January data is not merely a post-holiday blip, it's an ominous sign that the engine of American consumer spending is stalling under the weight of overbearing policies, rising costs, and deep-seated economic mismanagement. If the faulty policies that have brought us to this critical juncture continue unchecked, we're looking at a future where the American dream might be deferred indefinitely, leaving only the bitter taste of policy failure in its wake. And remember, folks, when leaders choose to mismanage our economic destiny for the sake of political point scoring rather than pragmatic, data-driven policy, we're all left clinging to the wreckage. It's time to demand accountability and common sense reforms before we find ourselves not just in a mild economic slowdown, but in a full-blown recession of epic proportions. The choice is clear: either we wake up and address these structural issues head-on, or we continue to laugh, or cry, at the absurdity of an economy run by misguided theatrics. Stay tuned, stay informed, and for heaven's sake, hold your policymakers accountable, because this economic roller coaster is nowhere near its final drop.